So I'm going to start again. This is the Program for Research on Black Americans and Mugwire Reunion. Today's May 23rd. We're about to have a great presentation by Christina Cross, who is an assistant professor / postdoc at Harvard in the Department of Sociology. And she does work on family structure, among other things in terms of Black families. And her presentation for today is Racialized Returns, examining racial variation and the impact of family structure on child outcomes. So please welcome Christina. Christina, you are free to share your screen.
Thank you for that introduction, Robert. And it's just a pleasure to be here with all of y'all today and to be a part of such a warm community. I'll be honest in saying I was a little nervous at first when Robert asked me if I would be interested in presenting, but then I had to remind myself I'm with family, right? And so I know that y'all are going to have my back, and I'm excited to be able to share what I've been working on. So I'm going to share my screen now, make sure this is the right one. I'm going to get into presenter mode. Give me 1 second here. Okay, so I want to make sure that you all can see my slides, but not anything else.
Actually, we see everything.
Okay.
Yes.
Let me try it again. Okay. How about now?
That's perfect.
Okay, great.
We just see your main slide.
Okay. So as you all know, the research process is not linear, and I really think that the research I'm going to present today really reflects that. As Robert was saying, I study families, race, and social inequality. And I started off in graduate school thinking a lot about extended family households and the lack of attention to them in general, but also specifically amongst Black Americans, given the importance of extended family relationships for our overall well-being. And so this project actually incorporates some of our research on extended families, but from a different angle, as you'll start to see. I saw over and over again that researchers were finding this sort of puzzling finding, which was that the impact of living apart from a biological parent, so living with a single parent, was smaller for Black youth. And people would sometimes say, well, maybe it's because, they have those big extended families and, maybe that's protective in some way. But I hadn't seen any research that actually tried to test that out and try to understand why is the impact of family structure, but specifically like a single parent family, different for Black youth. So that's what we're going to be focused on today. So just some brief background here. Over the last several decades, there's been a major shift in children's household living arrangements. As you can see, there's been a decline in the share of children who have grown up with both biological parents, that's living in a two-parent family. And this has been accompanied by a rise in the percentage of children living with one biological parent or growing up in a single parent family. And these changes in children's household living arrangements, also referred to as family structure, have not occurred evenly across the population. In particular, Black households have experienced a sharper decrease in the share of youth who live in a two-parent family relative to white households. And the racial gap in the proportion of children being raised by both biological parents has widened over time. And so these changes in children's family structure have led researchers to question how growing up outside a two-parent family may impact youth outcomes. And on average, results are showing that children who live apart from a parent tend to fare worse than those who grow up with both parents on a number of key indicators of well-being. And that's evidenced by this rigorous meta-analysis that was conducted by Amato and Keith in the 1990s, examining the mean effect sizes of parental divorce on child outcomes. And a decade later, he followed up with another meta-analysis and found similar findings. And so this decline in two-parent families in the US, the racial gap in the share of children who live with both biological parents, and this persistent negative effect of living apart from a parent has led some researchers, policymakers, practitioners, and even moral leaders to be concerned that differences in the distribution of family structure across racial groups may exacerbate existing racial inequality in children's life chances. And in the 1990s, a ton of research, but also policies came out really focused on trying to promote the two-parent nuclear family structure, reduce non-marital births for Black families in particular. And actually, I mean, we know this goes back as late as the 60s and 70s with the Moynihan Report. But I think that there are some important considerations to bear in mind before we try to account for group disparities in youth outcomes as merely a function of family structure. And one thing I want to note is that increases in inequality are frequently attributed to family structure without reference to how group differences in family structure are themselves rooted in systemic inequities. And that's to say that decisions about who to live with don't take place in a vacuum, and racial disparities in mass incarceration, employment opportunities, and housing, just to name a few factors, play a role in shaping children's household living arrangements. And I'm sure I really don't have to tell you all this, but this is something that I often want to point out in these presentations. But second, the two-parent nuclear family is typically treated as the universally appropriate reference category in empirical studies, even as a burgeoning literature points to approaches to household living arrangements that extend beyond the nuclear family, such as living with extended relatives. And several members of this audience have done really important research related to extended family support networks, particularly within the Black community. And I've been fortunate to work with several of them. But lastly and importantly, there's been a growing body of research that has shown that while children who live outside a two-parent family tend to fare worse than their peers who grow up with both parents, the consequences of living apart from a biological parent are not the same across racial groups. And that's where I want to focus our attention today. I was really struck by that finding and wanted to unpack it. And I think it's important because if family structure effects differ by racial group membership, then differences in the distribution of family structures along racial lines may not result in that same level of increased racial inequality or inequality at all. And there have been studies that have shown that the negative consequences of living apart from a parent are weaker for children of color than for white youth. And just thinking back to that meta-analysis that I mentioned a few moments ago, Amato and Keith actually found that the magnitude of the association between parental divorce and educational attainment was nearly twice that for white children than for Black children. Similarly, Donafone and Kowaleski-Jones found that living with a single parent was associated with worse outcomes for white children, but not their Black peers. Formby and Cherlin noted that changes in family structure led to worse cognitive outcomes for white children, but did not find an effect for African-American youth. And in a recent causal mediation analysis, Brand and colleagues noted null associations between divorce and educational attainment for children of color. So these prior studies have shown us that the effect of family disruption is on average weaker for minoritized youth. But scholars have noted that the factors explaining these heterogeneous associations are poorly understood. And that is why I have decided to take on this investigation. I think this is an area that is ripe for more empirical study. And so my recent work seeks to advance these areas in 3 key ways, which I've listed here on the slide. Today, I'm going to share an example of my recent work that reflects the first contribution. I'm going to present a study that examines how popular factors that have been speculated to explain racial differences in family structure effects actually stand up to rigorous empirical testing. And so this paper, it evaluates 2 hypotheses that have been posited to explain the differential relationship between family structure and children's educational attainment. And it focuses on differences between the 3 largest racial ethnic administrative categories, so Blacks, whites, and Hispanics. But to streamline my discussion, I'm going to focus on differences between Black and white youth, but findings for Hispanics largely mirrored that of Black children. But before we try and explain why family structure matters differently for Black and white youth, it's important that we quickly review what we already know about how family structure influences children's outcomes in the first place. And so here's a slide that shows the current conceptual model depicting the relationship between family structure and child outcomes. And researchers have posited that family structure impacts children's outcomes through 2 distinct but not mutually exclusive mechanisms. So there's economic resources and parenting practices. And basically living apart from a parent can compromise child outcomes by reducing important economic resources such as income and wealth, which also may reduce the quality of parenting that children experience, leading to worse outcomes. And there have been two major mechanisms that have been hypothesized to explain why minoritized children may be less vulnerable to the negative consequences of living outside a two-parent family. And those are the socioeconomic stress and extended family embeddedness hypotheses. And basically, scholars who are advancing the socioeconomic stress hypothesis point to the fact that in the US, race and ethnicity are fundamental axes of inequality along which resources are distributed. And due to a history of contemporary and historic structural racism, minoritized families on average have access to fewer socioeconomic resources such as income and wealth and quality neighborhoods than white families. And we know economic resources are an important mechanism through which family structure functions. And as a result of this, they are more likely to be exposed to socioeconomically stressful environments. And some scholars have suggested that the exposure to an overabundance of socioeconomic deprivation means that the additional stress that's incurred by living apart from a parent is only marginally impactful above and beyond existing social disadvantages. And so we can sort of think about this as a risk factor, socioeconomic deprivation. And then there are other scholars who advance a more protective factor. They point to this extended family embeddedness hypothesis, which suggests that children of color are more deeply integrated into extended family networks than their white peers. And the research on extended family networks of Black Americans finds that this group is engaged in ongoing and reciprocal exchanges of support. Black families are more likely to be involved in practical support, like help with household chores and transportation and childcare than white families. And actually, Dr. Taylor and Dr. Chatters and a couple of other PRBA scholars actually just published a paper in JMF showing similar findings, which continues to add to what we already know, but with even more clarity and with richer measures. They also Black Americans tend to live in closer proximity to extended relatives than white Americans. And according to this hypothesis, greater involvement in these extended family networks may reduce some of the negative psychosocial effects associated with parental conflict or separation. And so my aim for this study was to use nationally representative longitudinal data to investigate the extent to which racial variation in these two mechanisms mediated the differential association between family structure and children's on-time high school completion and college enrollment. And in order to do this, 4 conditions need to be met. I have to first demonstrate that there is a relationship between family structure, the 2 educational outcomes that I've selected. I need to determine if any observed relationship differs by racial group membership. Next, I need to confirm that there are group differences in socioeconomic stress and extended family embeddedness. Before lastly assessing the extent to which these 2 mechanisms explain any observed differences in family structure effects. And so for this study, I used 31 years of data from the Family Study of Income Dynamics, which is the world's longest running household panel study. It began in 1968 and has followed about 5,000 households forward until present day. And detailed information is collected on household composition, employment, income, education, and housing, just to name a few items. And I merged the PSID core data with information about children's educational background from its 2 youth-centered supplements, the Child Development Supplement and the Transition into Adulthood Study. And my analytic sample included children who were present in at least half the waves in which they could have been observed, who responded to at least one wave of the Transition to Adulthood Study and provided information about their educational status and attainment. And that yielded a sample of approximately 2,600 children. And so my key independent variable, as you probably have guessed at this point, is family structure. And it is actually a continuous variable. I look at the proportion of childhood that children spend in a 2-parent family versus living with a single mother or her non-biological partner. And I used a variety of indicators of socioeconomic stress and extended family embeddedness, which I've listed here on the slide. And I also include a number of demographic controls. And weighted data are representative of young adults who were born between 1985 and 1997, and whose families have been in the US since 1968. So basically my cohort of millennials. And so now I'm going to address quickly my first research goal: is the relationship between family structure and children's on-time high school completion and college enrollment. And table 1 here provides an answer. It's displaying odds ratios from logistic regression models predicting on-time high school completion. And so in my first baseline model, I just estimate the direct association between family structure and high school completion and college enrollment. And then in model 2, I include an interaction term for Black youth. And then in models 3 and 4, I add in indicators of socioeconomic stress and extended family embeddedness before jointly including all covariates in model 5. But I don't want to get ahead of myself. My goal right now is to simply determine in model 1 whether a relationship exists, and then we can discuss the subsequent models. And so the answer to that question is yes, there is a statistically significant relationship between family structure and on-time high school completion. And we see here that children who spend more time living with a single mother or a mother and a non-biological partner are less likely to graduate high school on time. And we find similar results for high school, for college enrollment. Yes, here in table 2 is showing that spending more time outside a 2-parent family is associated with lower odds of college enrollment. And so my next research goal then is, do any of these observed associations differ by race? And so here in model 2, I included that interaction term for Black youth, and we see that it is highly significant and positive, signifying a weaker negative association between family structure and on-time high school completion for this group when compared to white youth. And so to help us better interpret that interaction, I calculated and graphed predicted probabilities for the family structure race interaction term. And figure 1 here displays these values, and it's showing that as Black children spend longer periods of time living with in a single mother family, the change in slope for the effect of living in this family structure, it declines less sharply than the change in slope for whites. And so this pattern is indicating that more time spent in this family structure is less negatively consequential for Black youth. And I'll just point out very quickly and somewhat surprisingly that the largest sort of gap in the probability of on-time high school completion is actually when single motherhood, the proportion of childhood spent living with a single mother is at 0. And because the reference category is a 2 biological parent family, that means that the largest sort of gap in the likelihood of on-time high school completion actually exists between Black and white children who are raised in stable 2-parent families. And shameless plug, I am now writing a book where I'm thinking more about why there are these disparities in the family structure that we think of as being the most ideal and the great equalizer for Americans. And actually it came partly out of this finding. But we won't get off into that too much. We're going to get back to the family structure race interaction term for college enrollment. And here again, we see that it is positive and significant, but it's not significant, which may suggest a differential association between family structure and educational outcomes based on the outcome of interest, but it likely has to do with just my sample size overall and not having enough power for that significant, for that coefficient that's positive to be significant. And so moving on to my third goal, we'll explore whether there are racial differences in socioeconomic stress and extended family embeddedness. And because we are short on time, I'm not going to go into it too much, but the answer is absolutely. On average, Black children are exposed to significantly more socioeconomic deprivation throughout childhood, but at the same time, they tend to be more deeply embedded in their extended family networks. And so, finally, we arrive at my fourth and final research goal for this study. To what extent do socioeconomic stress and extended family embeddedness explain this differential relationship between family structure and educational attainment? And so I added in indicators of socioeconomic stress in model 3, and we see that family structure race interaction term is no longer significant, which indicates that socioeconomic stresses are helping to explain this differential association. when we add in separately indicators of extended family embeddedness, it is significant still, but we'll see in a moment the extent to which the changes in the coefficients reveal some sort of influence of extended family embeddedness. And lastly, I'll say about in my fifth model, I include all the covariates together. And not only is that family structure race interaction term no longer significant, but also the direct association between family structure and extended family embeddedness, which really means that combined socioeconomic indicators of socioeconomic stress and indicators of extended family embeddedness completely explain the relationship between family structure and children's on-time high school completion and college enrollment. Okay, so I was able to demonstrate that socioeconomic factors related to socioeconomic stress and extended family embeddedness seem to matter. But what I could not do with those low chip models was assess their relative influence. And it has to do with the fact that when you include additional covariates in these models, you run into a situation of attenuation bias when new variables are included in low chip models. So I use the decomposition technique to assess the relative influence. And I found that both sets of factors mattered, but socioeconomic stressors tended to explain more of the variance in terms of the differential association between family structure and education by race. And you see that for both on-time high school completion and here college enrollment. So we made it to 20 minutes and that is the end of the presentation. Thank you all for your time and attention. And I just look forward to continue to be in community with y'all today.
Questions. We have at least 5 minutes, 6 minutes, 7 minutes for questions. And again, thank you, Christina, for a great job. You can either speak up, but if we have several people speaking up, then just raise your hand. And if you go on the reactions, you'll see at the bottom of the reactions, there's something that says raise hand. So questions, comments? So I have a, not a question, but a comment. And I've always been amazed at how much white scholars in particular put so much emphasis on family structure. It is almost as if that is the only thing that people want to study when it comes to Black families, as if there's nothing else that's going on, or not, you know. And it has always been a quandary to me that is the big issue, you know. Christina, you have any comments based on your conversations with people?
You know, I was struck by that too. And like you, I'm deeply concerned about it. You know, as a graduate student at Michigan, I took a course on families and social inequality, and that never came up in the conversation, but implicit and sometimes explicitly in many of the studies we were reading, that was an explanation for inequality, which is deeply problematic because it lacks any attention to sort of structural factors, which is also ironic because we're sociologists, right? I was in a sociology PhD program, but I think it actually reflects a larger tendency to sort of explain away racial inequality through individual behaviors. You know, this is a choice that you're making about your family. And if you just did something different, then, you know, we'd be on par with white Americans in any other group. And so I'm hoping that to some degree, my research can really push back on that narrative, which really prevents, I think, many policymakers and everyday Americans from taking responsibility for the marginalization of Black Americans and other minoritized groups in general with the whole family structure sort of narrative.
Let me just add, and thank you, Christina, for your presentation, but let me just add that in addition to these sort of individual types of attributions about success, you know, originating in the family, there is a really strong tendency to be acontextual in understanding Black families, as well as understanding the policies and programs that favor what's been called the standard North American family, the notion of the two-parent family, typically white, male breadwinner, those sorts of things. Many policies favor that family form, but it's never recognized. So this acontextual understanding of Black families includes how policy aids certain types of families, but we never spend a lot of time talking about that. So I think your work is really important for sort of peeling back this notion of, let's look at the context that families are operating in.
Thank you, Linda, for one, that recognition, but also for you really pointing that out, because I think that that's an important thing to keep at the fore of our minds, is that there are hundreds of policies and laws that really privilege the standard North American family, which tends to be more dominant amongst the white, middle, and upper middle classes, and at the same penalizes, other family structures when it comes to even receiving benefits and access to the safety net. And unfortunately, even when Black Americans are in this more traditional family structure, we often still experience a penalty. And Dorothy Roberts has written so much about that and thinking about the marriage penalty in terms of the tax code.
Thank you. Annalitas?
I had more. Can you hear me?
Barely, but go ahead.
Better now?
Yes.
It's better.
Right. Yeah, I had more of a comment more in line with what Robert was saying. I know that you didn't discuss outcomes for Latino families, but you said that it was different, similar to what you found for Black families. And so, yeah, I just wanted to, I guess, echo what Robert was saying. So I grew up in a Latino family in Miami, and I went to a school where most kids had a single mom, but yet we all had a large extended family. I am one of 35 grandchildren just on one side, and then one of I think we're 14 on the other side, right? So that was a big part of my life, but I recall being in school and then the textbook would teach about the nuclear family, and I would think, what is that? And then just there not being any alternative to that. So I just wanted to thank you. And I think that this is really important when it comes to understanding the structure of families in the US, and in the context of a diversifying population, it's important to think about how not just amongst Latino and Black families, but also families from other ethnicities that have a more I don't know if it's community oriented or approach, I guess, to parenting. And yet they're really your research is very innovative in the sense that it kind of contradicts what has always been taught. So thank you for that.
Yeah.
Thank you. And I'm glad it resonated with you. I really appreciate that support. One of the things that I found when we think about extended family households, it's often kind of represented as something that is rare and very niche or limited to a subset of the population. But one of the things that came out of my dissertation research is that even living with an extended relative is only rare amongst white, well-off families. For the rest of Americans, that's pretty common for children at some point to live with an extended relative or to live very close to them and to be in regular sort of exchange of resources with them.
Yep. Belinda?
Hi, thank you for that excellent presentation. It seems to me that your research is also making a statement, which is something we've been trying to do for some years, about the meaning of marriage and the fact that marriage does not necessarily convey these assumed advantages that all of these policies assume. There are presumptions about what marriage means, at least to white Americans, that just may not be relevant for, all kinds of other populations.
I agree. That is one of the things that I hope to be able to even articulate even more clearly. This idea, I focused on the measurement of family structure in some of my research and also its consequences, but what about the meaning of it, right? And the fact that it may not even mean the same thing to everyone. And certainly within our laws, it hasn't yielded the same sort of opportunities, right? And so that would shape perhaps even the way that one saw this particular family structure or marriage in particular.
Thank you. Any other questions? Okay, before we move on, I'm sorry, anybody else? Okay. So before we move on, I just want to mention one or two things. Camille, are you here? I'm calling you out for a second if you're right around. Okay, maybe Camille will come back. Camille's going to be a new professor here at Michigan, starting.
I am here. I
Yes.
apologize. I was trying to work the Zoom on my iPad, so forgive me.
So I guess want y'all to for people who are here in Michigan to meet Camille, because again, she is a brand new professor coming in. Camille, when do you start?
I start August 29th.
August 29th. And she is leaving a okay place and coming to a wonderful place.
I can say he is not telling a lie. He is telling nothing but facts. Thank you so much, Dr. Taylor.
Yeah, she's leaving Ohio State. So, you got to say that. Normally, I wouldn't mention anything like that.
It's all good.
Yeah. And the other thing I just want to mention that we have a lot of really great doctoral students and postdocs here with us who are doing great work. So as y'all talk to them, I just want to let y'all know these are fantastic young individuals here with us. So next we're going to move on to one of the, and our next two people are the leaders in their fields. And one is Eleanor Seaton, who's clearly a leader who's published in all the major developmental child psych journals. And her presentation is the racialized and gendered implications of pubertal development. And she's a professor in the School of Social and Family Dynamics at Arizona State. So please welcome Eleanor. And Eleanor, you can share your screen.
All right, tech is not my thing, so let me, usually my students help me out. So can you only see my screen? I don't want you to see my notes.
Yes, we only see your screen.
Okay, perfect. I got that right with no student help. Okay, so thank you, Robert. Thank you for inviting me. I'm so glad Christina admitted that she was nervous, because I've been nervous all day. And then I finally said, this is family. Like, what am I doing? I should be fine. So thank you. Thank you, Christina, for admitting that. Thank you, Robert, for inviting me. And thank you to everyone else for coming. So I want to start off with some acknowledgements. I am in Arizona, and the wealth of Arizona is due to stolen land. Arizona State in particular sits on land that used to be inhabited by the Pima and Maricopa Indian communities. And so I want to acknowledge the stolen land that's created not just the wealth of Arizona, but possibly the wealth of this, well, no, not possibly, the wealth of this entire nation. So I'm going to talk about pubertal development. And I was trying to think about how did I get interested in this? And I can't really remember. I know that when I arrived at UNC Chapel Hill, I negotiated a startup package, and I included the pubertal development scale into my survey component of my study. I had a qualitative component, a survey component, and a daily diary component. But in general, everybody probably remembers puberty. Hopefully we all made it through okay. And it simply prepares people for sexual reproduction and sexual maturation. That's the whole point of puberty, to get you ready to reproduce. However, there's variation in puberty in terms of the timing when it occurs. And this is the age at which youth physically mature. And there's also variation in the tempo, the rate of maturation. How long do you spend maturing through this developmental process? And pubertal timing can be assessed either objectively, and that's using pediatrician reports or hormones or the Tanner stages, or a lot of empirical research uses subjective reports in which we ask kids to compare themselves to their peers? Do they think they are early, on time, or late? And so I just want to talk about some of the indicators, because as you can imagine, indicators vary based on whether we're talking about boys or girls. And so I've mentioned pubertal timing, in which kids are classified as early, on time, or late. And this is, again, objective or subjective. There's pubertal tempo. There's a growth in height. I'm sure we all remember that growth spurt, where we might have grown 5, 6, or 7 inches over the course of a summer or the course of a school year. There is the growth in body hair, which includes pubic hair, but also underarm hair. There is the dreaded acne. How many of us remember the acne that accompanies pubertal development? And then for girls, we have breast development and the onset of menarche. And then for boys, we have voice changes and the growth in facial hair. So again, there's overlap in some of the indicators, and then some indicators vary by sex. And this is particularly for people who are binary on the gender spectrum. We don't know a lot about pubertal development for youth who identify as non-binary. So I want to emphasize that. Now, in general, Black American boys and girls begin puberty earlier than all of their counterparts. So Black girls tend to start puberty in middle childhood around the ages of 9 and 10. And Black boys tend to start in early adolescence, 11, 12. But both of these groups are starting much earlier than their white, Asian, and Latinx counterparts. And this trend has been documented in the literature for about 25 years now, that in general, Black American boys and girls are going to start earlier than their same gender counterparts when it comes to pubertal development. And I'm going to talk later about some of those implications for that. So when I first delved into this work, I noticed that there wasn't a lot of specificity. Many of the pubertal scholars are white people, either pediatricians, they're in nursing departments, or they may be developmentalists like me. And it was simply that puberty starts early. Early puberty is linked to these bad outcomes, and people who start puberty early in bad neighborhoods have more bad outcomes. Very, very generic. And along with my colleagues, we wanted to delve into the specificity. And the question that drives my puberty work is simply, how is puberty complicated for Black youth because of race and gender? And so I'm going to talk about sort of a compilation of results so far from this research, which I started over 10 years ago. And I classify the lessons into 4 types: the intersection of ethnicity and race, ethnicity and gender, puberty and discrimination experiences, the importance of racial identity, and the fact that context matters. And so my colleagues and I have complicated the study of pubertal development for Black youth in a way that hasn't been done when we look at what our white colleagues have done. So let's talk about ethnicity and gender. And as you all are very familiar with the NSAL data, we have examined ethnic variation in pubertal development, looking at pubertal development for the Caribbean Black adolescents and comparing them to African-American girls. And we found that Caribbean Black girls were more likely to report themselves as having early pubertal timing, whereas African-American girls were more likely to report that their pubertal timing was on time. And this is a significant difference just for these 2 ethnic groups. Yet the Caribbean Black and African-American boys both perceive themselves as being on time. So when we really get into ethnicity and gender, we see a difference in the girls that we don't see for the girls. For the boys, for the Black boys. We also see one of the longstanding relationships in the literature for Caribbean Black girls. And so early pubertal timing has been linked to internalizing and externalizing behaviors. And we found this to be true with the NSL data, but only for early developing Caribbean Black girls. They engaged in more externalizing behaviors than their on-time or late developing counterparts. However, we did not find a significant association between pubertal timing and externalizing behaviors among the African-American girls. So despite the literature saying that early development for girls is generally bad, We only found this for Caribbean Black girls as it related to externalizing behavior. So again, this ethnic variation matters, and we can't just think of puberty as this simple static outcome for everyone. And last but not least, we found differences when we started to look at the indicators for boys for African American and Caribbean Black boys. So for voice changes, the relationship between voice changes and self-esteem was stronger for African American boys compared to their Caribbean Black counterparts. What we found when we looked at subjective pubertal timing, this impact was stronger on self-esteem for Caribbean Black boys compared to their African American counterparts. So again, when we look at different pubertal indicators by ethnic group within same genders, we see that the story is much more complicated than we may have believed. Now, I have long been interested in discrimination experiences, and this is also one of the questions that drives my work, whether or not people who report early pubertal timing have more discriminatory experiences. And again, using the NSAL data, we found that early developing African American and Caribbean Black girls reported more general and racially discriminatory experiences than their on-time or late developing counterparts. So this idea that you're early developing increases these experiences because people are perceiving you as more adult-like, even though your chronological age is still consistent with being childlike. Now, I want to probe this further, but I'm going to come back to this point as well. And the third lesson has to do with the importance of racial identity. When I first started working in this area, I was shocked that scholars had not connected this normative process, puberty, with racial identity, which has been one of the most studied outcomes among the African American population across all developmental periods. So Rona and I, using again the NSAL data with the MIBI, the Multidimensional Inventory of Black Identity, we wanted to know how racial identity was operating in this relationship between pubertal development, pubertal timing, and outcomes. And we found that using NICHD's public data, African American boys who felt positive about being Black, that's high private regard levels, who were late developing or had late pubertal timing, they had less internalizing symptoms 1 year later. So longitudinally, high private regard levels seem to be protective. However, African American boys with high public regard levels, and this is the belief that the broader society views Blacks positively, who were early developing, they had more internalizing problems 1 year later. So early developing Black boys with public regard levels that may be inconsistent had showed more internalizing issues 1 year later. So the type of identity dimensions seem to very much matter in the context of puberty. And when we think about girls, and this is some of my data that I collected for my project while at UNC, we also found how racial identity differentially interacts with pubertal timing and outcomes. So among African American girls who were late developers, they classified themselves as late pubertal timing. Those who believed that race was very important to their identity, this is high racial centrality levels, they were linked to having more depressive symptoms. Similarly, African American girls who were early developers, who had low public regard levels, they believed that the broader society viewed Blacks negatively. Those were also linked to increased depressive symptoms. So again, these racial identity dimensions matter differently depending on early or late development and internalizing outcomes. And the last thing I want to say about identity, we found some very interesting effects when we looked at the NSAL data, looking at ethnicity, development, identity, and outcomes. So African American and Caribbean Black boys who had early developing voice changes and felt that society viewed Blacks negatively, these are low public regard levels. These early voice changes were linked to increased depressive symptoms. Now, this is true for both African American and Caribbean Black boys. However, Early voice changes did not predict increased depressive symptoms among African American and Caribbean Black boys who felt that the broader society views Blacks positively, those who had high public regard levels. So my identity work really suggests that the way kids are thinking about puberty is impacted by how they have perceptions of various indicators of Blackness, various indicators of being Black. And the last area that's been really fruitful is looking at context. I'm a developmentalist and I know that context matters. And this was one of our really interesting findings where we linked for African American girls who believed that race was important to their overall identity, high racial centrality levels. This was linked with depressive symptoms among those who were classified as late developing, but only if they attended predominantly white schools. We did not see this relationship for girls who were in predominantly Black schools. And similarly, African American girls who were early developers, who had low public regard levels, again, they believe that society views Blacks negatively. These were linked with depressive symptoms for, again, those who attended predominantly white schools. So schools matter when we think about pubertal development, racial identity, and depressive symptomatology. And the last context finding using NSAO data, again, African American and Caribbean Black males with early developing hair growth who lived in neighborhoods with more Black residents had higher depressive symptoms. This was not true for their early developing counterparts who lived in neighborhoods with fewer Black residents. And I want to highlight again that hair growth has to do with underarm and pubic hair, not necessarily facial hair. And so we're finding, again, this intersection of neighborhood racial concentration, pubertal development, racial identity, and mental health outcomes. So when you put all of this together, despite the fact that the pubertal research makes this seem like a simple and seamless process, it's not. It's very complicated for Black youth when you actually try and disentangle ethnicity, gender, specific indicators, you add in discrimination, you add in racial identity, and you add in context. It's quite complicated for Black youth, even though this is a normative and universal process. So I want to end and talk about where am I going? What is next for me? And all of it in this, everyone in this Zoom is probably familiar with the weathering hypothesis. Your very own Arlene Geronimus developed this and told us that coping with acute and chronic stressors like racism can result in accelerated aging and subsequent poor health. Again, this audience very familiar with weathering. I argued in a conceptual paper that early pubertal timing, because again, Black youth are the first to start pubertal development compared to their same gender counterparts. I argued that this is one of the initial signs of accelerated aging. And when we think about this pubertal trend, we should be placing it in the context of racism, given that for Black youth, racism starts in utero. They actually experience in utero through their mothers. And so early pubertal timing may be another example of accelerated aging conceptually, and that we need to start to test this. Thankfully, here at Arizona State, we examined the weathering hypothesis and whether or not this predicted early pubertal timing. Now, we examined whether peer racism experiences in 5th grade predicted earlier pubertal timing in 7th grade, which then predicted in increases in internalizing and externalizing symptoms in 10th grade. So this is a longitudinal mediator model. And we found support for the model, but only for US Mexican boys who lived in neighborhoods with high levels of Latinx families. So we called it weathering in context. We only found support for weathering when they lived in neighborhoods with high concentrations of other Latinx families, and only for US Mexican boys. We did not find this for US Mexican girls. Obviously, I would like to probe this further with Black youth. Another direction I want to go in, I want to disentangle age in the context of racism. And so Gilbert Gee and colleagues published a paper recently, and they talked about the need to disentangle the different types of ages that kids have to experience. Chronological age, of course, the actual age of a person; social age, the age that individuals perceive themselves to be, or the age that others perceive them to be. And then, of course, biological age refers to the notion that one's body might be older or younger than expected for their chronological age. And so my question, are Black youth with advanced social ages due to early pubertal development more likely to experience racism, which then increases their biological ages? And to test this hypothesis, I want to also use hormones to capture pubertal development from a multi-trait perspective. So not only assessing the subjective experiences, but using hormones as well. Now, this hypothesis comes from a study conducted by Phil Goff and colleagues, who told us that white adults perceive Black boys and girls to be older than their white same-age counterparts. And as we know from Tamir Rice, the intersection of race, gender, and various ages can be fatal. I want to read a quote from the Cleveland Police Patrolmen's Association president about the Tamir Rice shooting after it happened. He said, "Tamir Rice is in the wrong. He's menacing. He's 5'7", 191 pounds. He wasn't that little kid you're seeing in pictures. He's a 12-year-old in an adult body." And as you can see, this is the picture of Tamir Rice, who was gunned down for playing with a fake gun in a Cleveland park. So this intersection of race, gender, age, and pubertal development can be fatal for some of our youth. And I want to explore this further. So I like to leave my audiences with take-home points. Pubertal development is universal, but race, ethnicity, gender, identity, and context complicate this normative process for Black youth. Early pubertal timing may be one of the first indicators of accelerated aging among Black youth, and the real-world implications of early pubertal development, as we see possibly for Tamir Rice, requires further examination. I would be remiss if I did not shout out my collaborators, your very own Rona Carter, my ride or die. Working with her has just been a game changer. And my colleague here at Arizona State University, Rebecca White, who has the longitudinal data on US-Mexican youth that we're using to test the weathering hypothesis. I definitely want to give them a shout out. They are invaluable to this work that I do, be it theoretical or even methodological. And I want to say thank you. And again, thank you, Dr. Taylor, for inviting me to present. And I look forward to all of your questions.
Thank you, Eleanor. So questions, again, thank you very much, very much. Questions?
I have a question.
Yes.
Hello, Dr. Seaton. Good to see you again.
Hey, how are you? Good to see you.
So I'm wondering about the subjective report of onset of puberty and the ways in which, of course, like African-American culture in particular, the ways in which we think about what is of the right age in terms of like body shape and like body mass. And I'm wondering like if you think that would have an impact in thinking about the context of puberty onset for folks who have an idea about what is seen as like a older age for Black women in terms of being more shapely and more robust. How would that impact the ways in which Black youth are comparing themselves in terms of puberty onset?
So you asked a really good question with multiple parts. The first thing, and this is something my colleague Rona Carter is taking up, she's developed this experimental technique to really delve into this. But when we think about the subjective perceptions, right, kids are comparing themselves to their peers. Something that's very interesting in the puberty literature is that puberty researchers didn't ask, well, who are you comparing yourselves to? And what we find when Black girls are comparing themselves to Black girls, then the early pubertal development doesn't have these negative consequences because of the things that you are suggesting. We're less susceptible to this thin ideal we're less likely to be angry about the fact that we're gaining fat and muscle, because for girls, they gain fat and muscle because, again, it's preparing them for childbirth. But as we sort of delved into, and we could not assess this with the data, when you're in white context, well, who are you comparing yourselves to? You're probably comparing yourselves to white girls who don't share the body type, don't share the diversity in body image, and typically hate the fact that they're gaining fat and muscle because they're more likely to subscribe to the thin ideal. So who are they comparing themselves to, and where are they? But puberty researchers weren't necessarily asking those questions like, well, who are the peers? And when they're Black peers, we just don't see those negative effects. But Rona Carter is trying to delve into that and body image. We have a paper under review. I have a colleague at Minnesota, Rich Lee, and he has some puberty data with Korean adopted youth who were adopted as infants from Korea and were raised in white households. And what we see is a combination of internalized racism, pubertal development, and ethnic identity, but early pubertal development is harmful for all of those reasons. So who are you around and who you're comparing yourself to is very important. But there's not a lot of work in that area. So it's a great question, Natasha. Hope you're well.
Camille?
Yes, thank you so much for your presentation, Dr. Seaton. This is fascinating work. I was really favorably activated by your what you shared, and in particular, your last points about what's on the horizon for you, and talking about the particular work where you referenced Tamir Rice and his demise. I've seen similar circumstances here in Columbus with Ma'Khia Bryant, who was also murdered by the police last year, and have last week actually participated in a talk with the colleagues from Case Western Reserve and Wayne State, where they're looking at this multi-site project that's centered around racial trauma and Black health disparities. And so my question for you is, considering what your interest is in that particular point about the perceived development, or what some have termed adultification of Black adolescents, and in particular with regard to Black girls and young women, it was noted by City Lab that Cleveland is now one of the worst places for Black girls and women to live. And so they are now also, similar to Columbus, initiating a commission on Black women and girls. And so my question to you is, how do you see this work intersecting with historical trauma, in the vein that we know from work by Joy DeGruy and others that talked about the role of slavery and how it continues to impact populations today? How do you see this particular component with regard to pubertal development and Black adolescents relevant? And what do you see as the, I guess, your view, short range, in terms of investigating this as a step toward, promoting some level of understanding about the full complement of Black adolescents as a whole?
Wow. Okay. Well, I think the adultification is a continuation of racial trauma, in the sense that Black children have never been granted the innocence that white children have been given. So I don't see those things as divorced. I see it as a continuation historically, where Black children just aren't giving innocence. And when you think about Phil Goff's work, and there's some other work by Naomi Priest, where you have white adults who are overestimating the ages of Black youth, this is a continuation of that. And we see the negative consequences that can occur. So I don't see this divorced from historical trauma or racial trauma, just more or less a continuation. When we're talking about white perpetrators, which is who I'm focused on, right? I think in the Black community, we can look at kids and we may think, you know, well, we're not going to overestimate their ages the way that our white counterparts might. So to your first question, I see it as a continuation. In terms of adolescent development overall, I guess I want the puberty field to, and this is part of what we're doing, to get its life, to gather itself, because I don't understand how you can study a process like this. And again, puberty is preparing bodies for sexual reproduction and maturation. And Black kids are becoming Black adults. And you can't divorce the Black from the adult. And so I want puberty research to be better contextualized about the fact that they are developing racialized and gendered and sexualized bodies, because we live in a white supremacist society and what that means. So that means theories have to be updated, how we study puberty. So this is just one example, Camille. The gold standard in puberty research are pediatrician reports, right? You know, you take your kid to the doctor rates them, you know, on the curve. You all who have kids know this. And when researchers use this, they design a study and they're recruiting families to take their kid to some strange pediatrician for their research. Well, I already know I can't ask my Black parents to take their kids to some strange doctor. They're just not going to do that. Unless it's their pediatrician, that's different. But they're not going to come to the pediatrician that I decided to work with. So I already know it's not going to be the gold standard for Black families. They're not going to do that. I would not do that unless it was my child's pediatrician. So this is what I mean, like the way that white puberty research, and maybe middle-class white families are more interested in doing that, taking them to white pediatricians. But I know Black families are not going to do that. So when I talk about saliva samples, we can get kids to spit and then we can look at hormones, or we can get kids to fill out surveys, you know, but the practice gold standard is simply not going to work in our community. And I already know that. I actually asked a lot of my cousins, hey, if I were doing this study, would you do X, Y, and Z all over the country? Cousins and sorority sisters, they're like, are you the pediatrician? Because if you're not the pediatrician, no. And so I'm like, yeah, I know. But so it has to just be a restructure, rethinking how we do this research. And it has to be centered in the Black experience. And this is what Rona and I have been doing. And it feels like an uphill battle. We can't get any money out these funding agencies because they want us to have a white control group. And if anybody has any ideas for me, holler at me offline. But it's really important to do this work because our kids are being adultified. This is resulting in fatal encounters, and we cannot just stand back and watch this. So great questions, though. And I know Robert looks like he wants me to stop talking.
Sort of, because I'm not gonna lie, this is difficult because I'm so enjoying this, but we got to make sure, you know. And
Right.
we have one last question for you from Andrew.
Hey, listen, Dr. Seaton, I thoroughly, and I'm like Rob as well, I thoroughly enjoyed your presentation.
Oh, thank you.
And I'm one that would like to help you find that money. My research has been, when you said North Carolina, I said, oh my God, that's where I am. So I'm very familiar with UNC. And I will try to communicate with you offline. My dissertation and a lot of work was on the subjective well-being of African-American males. And I'll end with, it's kind of like, I'd be damned if I did it and damned if I didn't. I grew up as that, playing high school ball and playing college ball, and just was a big boy. And ran into all kinds of problems because of that. So
Right.
it's, yeah, but I never, and I wanted to ask also, and I may find it in your paper, is that the quantitative or qualitative, the one in American psychology, because
It's quantitative. Yeah, everything's quantitative. Yeah,
Good,
everything is
good.
quantitative.
Okay, so I'll go in there and look for models because I wanted to ask about the subjective well-being and more specifically the self-esteem being a mediator or one of your direct variables to down. But I'll take a look at that and
Okay.
look forward to reaching out to you at Arizona State in the future.
Okay. Thank you so much. I put my email in the chat. All right, Robert, I'm going to shut up.
Thank you.
Thank you. And I'm serious. I've truly enjoyed this presentation. I've truly enjoyed both presentations. And when I say this, I'm very serious. The three presenters we have today are the top of their field, okay, bar none. And this is not just me subjectively saying because I like y'all, right? This is very objective, just looking at the research that's done. Lisa Barnes, who's about to present, is, in my estimation, the #1 African-American who studies dementia among African-Americans. And it's sort of fascinating what we're talking about in terms of weathering among kids and the kind of things that people do in dementia research. But here, let me go ahead and introduce Dr. Lisa Barnes. And Dr. Lisa Barnes is the Alla and Solomon Jesmer Professor of Gerontology and Geriatric Medicine at Rush Alzheimer's Disease Center. And her discussion today for us is building a program of cognitive aging among older African Americans in Chicago. So please, everybody, welcome warmly Dr. Lisa Barnes.
Thank you, Robert. Thank you all so much for hanging in there for the last presentation too. I know it's late, especially for people in the East Coast, or in Michigan rather. So I'm gonna, can you see my slides?
Yes.
Okay, great. So I'm sort of on the other end of the spectrum, but I really feel like everything that I've heard today in the previous two presentations just resonates so much with what I'm trying to do in my studies. So just to give you a very brief background, I was at Michigan and I was in biopsychology. So I was the only Black person. I think I was the second Black person to get a PhD in that department. And I had the opportunity to come over to ISR and PRBA with James Jackson. He was very welcoming. He basically saved me from being around all of those people all the time. And I was able to, work on projects. They weren't part of my dissertation, but it was just a chance for me to get away and see other people. So I just, when Robert asked me to present, I could not say no, because I just feel like I owe such a debt of gratitude to James Jackson. So I wanted to talk a little bit about the program that I've built on cognitive aging among African Americans in Chicago. So, but I want to give you a little bit of background first on the condition. And I'm sure everyone's aware of it because it's very common right now. But Alzheimer's dementia is one of the most common diseases of aging. In 2014, about 5 million people were thought to have dementia, but by 2060, that number is going to increase to 14 million unless we find a cure or effective treatments to slow down the growth of the disease. So 1 in 3 people are thought to have Alzheimer's, and it's kills more people than breast cancer and prostate cancer combined. It's a very costly disease. It costs us, our society, $355 billion in 2021. This is going to increase to 1.1 trillion, again, if we don't find a cure. And this does not even take into account the toll it takes on families. Over 11 million caregivers provide unpaid care costing $257 billion. Now, at the same time that this disease is happening, we have another thing that's happening, and that's that our nation is becoming much more diverse. So this is census data from out of Kaiser that showed that in 2016, people of color made up about 39% of the population, but by 2050, these groups will no longer be the minority in number, will actually be the majority. And this is the population overall, but if you look at the older age population, you're going to see a very similar trend where older Asians, Hispanics, and Black African Americans are going to increase their numbers much more than whites. And so this is a particular problem for African Americans, the population that I study, because it's thought that they are about 2 times more likely than whites to have Alzheimer's dementia. They're also less likely to receive a timely diagnosis, and they are under-included in Alzheimer's disease and related dementia trials. And I don't know if you were watching the news recently, but it was, in the news, there was this new drug that came out. The first drug to be FDA approved in, like 20 years. And it was fast-tracked by the FDA. And it was a lot of controversy around it for many different reasons. But the thing that was really devastating to a lot of people in the field was that there were only 6 Black people in the trial. And if you have that many people in a trial, you cannot determine if the drug is safe. You cannot determine if the drug is effective. So luckily the drug was, taken off the market, and now it's only available for people in clinical trials, and not, CMS is not going to pay for it. But it was a huge deal, and it just really shows what happens in this field. So this is the disparity that I'm talking about. As you can see, there are, I just lost my slides, I'm sorry. There are, this is data out of Kaiser, out of Oakland. So they had a database of over 270,000 enrollees, and they looked at the Medicare claims data and to see the incidence of dementia. And they found that African Americans were much more likely to have dementia than any other group, followed closely by American Indian and Alaska Native. Sorry, guys, I'm having trouble with my slides for some reason. Wait a minute. I'm gonna have to stop sharing and then share again. I'm so sorry. Something is happening here.
Not a problem.
Okay, all right. They won't advance. Can you see it now? But it won't advance for some reason. What is happening? Oh my goodness, I cannot believe it. Mostly because I'm tired. I want to advance. Oh, there we go. Okay. Okay, sorry. All right, so I'll go back to this. Okay, so this study has, many people, 270,000 people, and we see that African Americans are much more likely to have dementia. But the problem with this research is that, the field has really struggled to include African Americans in clinical studies, including these cognitive aging studies. I've told you that there's this huge disparity, that we are under-included in clinical trials, that we don't get a timely diagnosis. Yet when you look at the landscape of research in this field, you see that the study here shows that they looked at maybe like 10 or 20 large population-based studies and found that they were dominated by predominantly white samples. So about 80% of the studies were composed of white people. And this is against the backdrop of what we already know about research with minoritized populations, that it can be very challenging to get people into your research when you don't have cultural sensitivity, when you don't center diversity. So these are data that came out of the Alzheimer's Association. They held a couple of focus group studies with different races and ethnicities. And I pulled these 2 questions out because I think they're really telling and shows what we as researchers who are in the aging space have to deal with. So they asked people, whether you would believe that medical research is biased against people of color. And you can see that Black Americans were much more likely to hold that belief. And then they asked, would you trust an Alzheimer's cure would be shared equally regardless of race, color, or ethnicity? And again, Black Americans were least likely to believe that that would be the case. So we are faced with this kind of a stigma or inability to win African Americans' trust. Is all completely justified. Remember, we are studying people who, are 65 and above. And so they have tremendous experiences with healthcare and discrimination and medical research abuse. So these findings are not surprising, but it's, I wanted to point them out because this is what we're having to deal with. So the objectives of my research program have really been to build an infrastructure and resource for investigators interested in understanding the aging profile of older African Americans. And really what I wanted to try to do was to understand cognitive aging specifically in African Americans, because like my previous speakers mentioned, most of the research has been grounded in white constructs, white ideas. Almost all the research has been white, and almost everything we know about this disease has been from studies in whites. And I really want to be able to give a voice to those who are historically underincluded in clinical Alzheimer's studies by specifically looking at risk and protective factors that might be uniquely relevant for cognitive decline in Alzheimer's dementia. And so one thing I want to point out is that in this field, the way that the gold standard way that we make diagnosis is we rely heavily on performance on cognitive function testing. So, tests of memory and thinking skills. But we know that cognition is influenced by many factors, and these factors also vary by race and ethnicity. And I have some of them listed here on this little diagram. And so most studies are cross-sectional. They measure, one time, and then they compare African Americans to whites. And so that really presents challenges for interpreting racial differences. And so what I want to be able to do is to sort of unpackage this to see if I can understand, this finding that African Americans are performing more poorly on these cognitive function tests and then ending up having a diagnosis of dementia. And so, my thought has always been that longitudinal designs are probably much better to address this question, especially when you're interested in understanding how race and ethnicity may play a role in the aging process. And so, with this kind of a design, you can identify risk factors, you can learn how the risk factors associate with cognition over time, and then, eventually develop strategies to either prevent Alzheimer's dementia by modifying lifestyle behaviors or identifying druggable targets so that we can develop medications. And so in 2004, I started the study called the Minority Aging Research Study, which is a study of African Americans. At the time, I started with 350 people. And, that it was a time when you could put the grant in multiple times. And I remember the first review that I got, they said, you really need social scientists on your team, somebody who really understands Black Americans, Black aging. And so I'm like, oh, I got the perfect person. Picked up the phone, called James Jackson. I was like, James, please, I need you. I need your help. And of course, he was so gracious. He agreed, and he was a consultant on my grant. And then even, later, once I got a Center for Health Disparities, he, was on my external advisory board and he was always that person for me, so I just have so much gratitude for him. But I just, I wanted to describe how it started for you because he has a special place in my heart because of that. But I started out with just 350 people. And so, over time it's grown, but we now have 800 African Americans. And the only criteria to get into the study is that you have to be at least 65 and you enroll without any known dementia. Now, most memory and Alzheimer's studies recruit from a memory clinic. We know that people who show up to medical care, especially from diverse communities, are often different from those people who don't have medical care. So I really wanted to remove that bias. And so we recruit directly from the community via churches, senior buildings, clubs, organizations, sororities, fraternities, wherever Black people hang out, that's where we go. And our evaluations are done all in the home annually. We never have the person come to our medical center to navigate parking and, the maze that our academic center is. We just take our team and we go to their homes to do the testing. And the testing consists of, a battery of cognitive testing, risk factor assessment, and we take blood. Our follow-up rate has been very good, over 90%. And then just this last fall, I got refunded again to follow years 16 to 20. So the grant's now been funded, 4 times. And again, I just, have so much gratitude to James Jackson, who I think really helped me build the foundation for this study. So the study is really grounded in the community, very community-centered engagement with, me as the investigator going out to the community, and my team, to really, give people the chance to understand about what we're doing. And we always say we're going to give first before we ask for anything. And so in fact, before I got the grant funded, I worked in the community giving health fairs and memory screens and presentations on healthy aging, so that by the time when I had to go in for the grant and have letters of support, I was able to get all these letters. And then I recruited 200 people in the first year because I had built these relationships. And because we're trying to keep people in the study, we also have to have these culturally celebratory retention events so that people want to remain in the study and they want to feel like they're a part of something bigger. And one thing that I learned working with older African Americans is that research is not the top of their list. Many times they have other competing demands. And so one of the grants that I was able to get was I incorporated social workers, because social workers are amazing and they can help, connect people to resources and help manage all those things that are sometimes get in the way of research. And so I hired a social worker, I hired retention specialists whose sole job was to create programs to keep people engaged and keep them, wanting to come back every year. And so I just want to run through some key findings that we're looking at, because I feel like they really resonate with some of the things that I heard in the previous talks. One of the things that we have been really interested in is understanding the role of discrimination in these older adults' life and how it impacts the aging process. So one of the first papers, that came out of the study was one where we use the Williams Everyday Discrimination Scale that came out of Michigan, and we gave it to our older adults. And we also take blood, so we were able to measure this protein in the blood called C-reactive protein, which is a marker of inflammation. And we found that discrimination, people who reported more discrimination had higher levels of this inflammatory marker in their blood, suggesting that, maybe inflammation is an underlying mechanism linking discrimination to poor health. Because we know that discrimination predicts all kinds of adverse outcomes, but most of the studies had been done in younger people at the time. And so, we were one of the first groups to start looking at this in older adults. And, since then, we've also shown that it's associated with cognition. So people who report more discrimination perform more poorly on our cognitive function tests, in particular, tests of memory and perceptual speed, which are key domains that are impaired in Alzheimer's disease. And we've looked at other studies to see how this exposure may be getting under the skin. So we image people's brains, and we found that people who report more discrimination have more impairment in areas that are important for trust perception. I'm working on a paper right now where I've also shown that discrimination is associated with the underlying pathology that's building up in people's brains that's associated with vascular disease. One thing I didn't tell you is that this study also gets brains from older African Americans, something that is incredibly challenging. And but we're one of the only groups that's really been able to do this successfully. We have about 150 brains from people, who signed a consent at the beginning saying, I'll give you my brain when I die. And it's been just so incredible to continue to work with families when we get these data. Another interesting risk factor that I wanted to probe was experience of attending schools in early life. So one of the questions that we ask people is, where were you born and where were you living when you were 12? So everybody in my study lives in Chicago now, but obviously at some point, many people migrated, during the Great Migration. So about maybe 40% of the sample came from the South. And so we asked people where they were born, and we found that people who were born in the South performed more poorly on our tests than people born in the North. We also asked them whether or not they had attended a segregated school when they were coming up. Now, we didn't find that segregation itself was associated with performance on these tests, but we did see an interaction such that those people who were born in the South and attended a legally desegregated school perform more poorly on our tests when they're 60 and 70, even more poorly than their counterparts who were born in the South attending a legally segregated school. Now, we were surprised by that because everything I read said the legally segregated schools were worse quality. The teachers were, not qualified. It was a one-room classroom, all these terrible things about going to a segregated school in the South. Now, I'm not saying it wasn't terrible for you, but clearly there's something about going into a school where everyone's white and you're not wanted. We've seen the pictures of people throwing things at the kids and, calling them, terrible names. Maybe that was an early life trauma that, left a mark on people, and we can see it 50, 60 years later when we're testing their memory and thinking skills. So, that's one of the things that we've looked at. Another thing we ask about is their perceived stress level. We use the Cohen perceived stress scale, and we found that people who report more perceived stress have faster rates of cognitive decline, particularly in episodic memory and visual spatial ability, than those who are reporting less perceived stress. And then the last one that I'll tell you about is John Henryism. I know this group knows John Henryism very well. No one had really looked at it with cognition. So, we give the scale to our older adults, and we found that John Henryism is associated with lower cognition or poorer performance on the test, because we wanted to understand, people are having these stressors in their life. How are they coping with it? And as Sherman James found that John Henryism was associated with mostly cardiovascular disease in Black men. But we're finding here that it's also associated with lower performance on the cognitive function test. And the effect is similar to having fewer years of education, because we know that education is associated with performance on these tests. So I'm going to stop here. I just wanted to really, sort of emphasize that, I have also been faced with criticisms about, why are you only studying Black people? Why don't you have a control group? How do you know these things matter if you don't have a white comparison group? Some of these things you can't ask in white people because they didn't experience it. So I think centering diversity is what needs to be done in this field, because until we do that, we don't know if that statistic is right, if African Americans are really having more Alzheimer's disease or not. There are reasons that people are performing poorly on those tests that we're using to measure cognition. Until we can understand those social determinants, we're not going to really get anywhere. And so again, I have just so much deep gratitude to James Jackson and PRBA and all of you for listening tonight. And I look forward to any questions you might have. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Barnes. That was absolutely spectacular, like all of the presentations. Questions?
Everybody's tired now.
Yeah. Maurice?
Hi, Dr. Barnes. My name is Maurice. That was an excellent presentation. I'm sorry I'm not on camera. I'm doing nighttime routine with the children. But I am a doctoral student at Penn, looking at intergenerational caregiving, looking at caregiver stress as a result of COVID-19, as it relates to intergenerational caregiving, amongst people who are caring for their aging parents, but also having young children to raise at the same time. Mm-hmm. So I'm curious in your work around Alzheimer's, around groups that related to us as African Americans, if anything regarding caregiving came to light in your research, and any intersection between that and Alzheimer's disease, and even the availability of caregivers for people with Alzheimer's disease, knowing that a lot of times African Americans we are providing more free, real caregiving services to our loved ones to keep them in the community.
Yes, that's a great question, Maurice. I actually had some questions, just a couple questions in the survey about caregiving, and I wasn't really seeing anything with those questions, but I do know that my participants are often taking care of grandkids. And I know in the idea in the field around caregiving is that it's a stressor, but in African Americans, it doesn't appear to be as stressful. They don't talk about it as a stressor. And so, that was why I wanted to include it in my study, but I did not find, just though I only had a couple questions, I didn't find that it was associated with cognitive decline or risk of dementia. It doesn't mean it's not. I probably need to look, keep following people a little bit longer. But if you have, questions that you think might be interesting to add or to include, I'd be happy to talk to you about that, because I do think that that's an important risk factor to consider. Because, I also want to understand some of the more positive aspects of aging that might help us understand resilience. Because, once people get to ages 65 and 70, and you're Black, you've been through a lot in your life, so there must be something that, that you are calling on that is helping you, mitigate all of the negative, the toxic, the trauma that you've experienced throughout your life. And so, caregiving might be one of those things. I know that I found that purpose in life is protective, against aging. So I'm always interested in understanding, some of these other maybe protective mechanisms that I can incorporate into the study. So if you have ideas, please let me know.
Absolutely. Thank you, Dr. Barnes. I'll certainly outreach to you. Thank you.
Okay, great.
Camille.
Yes, I just really wanted to follow up actually on Maurice's question with regard to caregiving, because I'm interested in this component as well with regard to adolescents who may be system involved. So I'm speaking of the youth punishment system, which people refer to as a juvenile justice system. I don't anymore, because it is not a justice system. It is a punishment system, and the term juvenile is it's what we would call stigmatizing. So I don't like language like that. So I'm really thinking about it, because I've done some work in terms of caregiver stress, but I'm now wanting to look at what you just cited, Dr. Barnes, is focus around caregiver joy or energy around relationships, and in particular for young people who are in the care of their grandparents because their parents, bio parents, for whatever reason, are just not available. And this kind of touches on the Dr. Cross's presentation, where she was talking about this notion around family structure. And so I tend to deconstruct that notion, as Dr. Taylor did, about family structure, because I think about it more in terms of the context of the relationships. So do you think system involvement of the children and or say these grandparents' children could influence some of what those cognitive qualities that they may have? Is that, and could it be protective even?
Absolutely. The problem with the field that I'm in is that people have not explored those types of questions. I can't think of any studies that have looked at family structure, as a protective factor or as even a determinant of aging at all. We have really been so focused on things that we've seen in whites as the explanatory variable. So, I've worked with people, other investigators who are mixed methods scholars. And I think, oh, you are too? I think that is some of the most intriguing ways to get at more questions that we can incorporate into the aging literature, because right now it's so narrowly focused on questions that are just pertinent to white people. So yes, I think that could be a factor that we can incorporate. So if you have ideas about it, I have a cohort that I want to share data. Anybody who's working on dissertation or whatever grant, I give my data out freely. And if you have ideas you want to share, you want to look into, just let me know. As I've built this so that I can learn more about us as a people. So, and help build a pipeline of other scholars interested in aging research. So I know you're at the other end of the spectrum, but you might have questions that will help inform what we're thinking about with aging. So please, let's share.
Thank you so much. Your work is fabulous. All of the presentations have just been outstanding, but I appreciate your time and your contribution to our people. Thank you so much.
Yeah. Russell.
Yes, thank you for that tremendous presentation, Dr. Barnes. I was very interested in the one of the findings about people who went to segregated schools versus desegregated schools, and as someone who falls into the desegregated school only experience, of course, I think that the teachers are, or certainly were at that time, were better. Come from a family of teachers, and several of my great aunts, at least one of my great aunts, I'm sure of, when the schools desegregated in Nashville, she was pulled over into the white schools because she was such a good teacher. So we had teachers that were there to prepare us to live in this world, then a segregated world, excuse me. And so I think that was an advantage in many ways. And it may show up, again, what's 60 years later in terms of my age range. What I'm interested in is we had another presentation earlier that used Caribbean youth when we were looking at the puberty presentation. Would it be productive for you to look at Caribbean Americans and look at this same kind of thing? And I don't know what the incidence is, if there's a difference in incidence of Alzheimer's among Caribbean Americans, or people who immigrated from the Caribbean, or people who grew up here who come from Caribbean backgrounds.
Yeah, no, that would be very productive. I'm in Chicago, so there's not a lot of Caribbeans in Chicago, I don't think. But there is a study in Columbia. Jennifer Manley has a study where she has Hispanics, Blacks, and whites, and she has a lot of Caribbean Hispanics. And she sees a very similar finding where they're performing, the risk of Alzheimer's seems to be, a little bit higher than it is in whites. So there's definitely some similarities there. I'm sort of, in Chicago, it's just not a lot of diversity when it comes to that. It's how people migrated, I guess, right? But I think I would love to be able to compare. And in fact, Robert and Linda and I and Dominique have a paper where we looked at discrimination in the national, what is it called?
NSAL.
And we compared Blacks and Caribbean Americans. I would love to have that richness in my own data, but this is what I have in Chicago. So
absolutely. Maybe you can partner up with some people that are in.
Yeah, get a national study. Yes. I would love that.
Absolutely. Yeah. Thank you very much.
Alexis?
Hi, thank you for that wonderful presentation. So I was wondering, kind of keeping on this theme of the weathering and the timing of onset, I'm wondering, I see a lot of studies of dementia that start at age 65. And I'm wondering how it was kind of recruiting your cohort, and if you think that this age 65 age range is kind of the best time to recruit, or if dementia may be happening earlier for Black Americans.
That's a great question. I definitely think that there's probably something happening a little bit earlier for Black Americans. And in fact, some data has shown that that's the case, but you really don't start seeing changes that you can pick up through cognitive testing until you get in your 60s, right? And because the grants, are 5-year cycle grants, if I started getting people near their 50, I would die before I finished the study. So I get people who are at least 65, but I already see that disparity is there when they come into my study. So I know that there's something that's happening beforehand, but the grant mechanisms are not such that I can, get people much younger. And I'd be waiting really, really long. But I do think that there might be other ways to pick this up. Maybe doing like, cohort design where, you have some people who might be in their 50s and you compare them a little bit to the people who are 65 and 70. It's a whole new recruitment stage, but I guess it could be done. But yes, a short answer is I think, yes, we should start earlier, but we have to change the grant mechanisms. Also, I'm getting brains, don't forget. So I have to wait for people to die. So that will be a very, very logistically challenging study to undertake.
Totally makes sense. Thank you.
Phil.
Excellent presentation. I know it's getting late, but a couple of quick questions. First of all, in Chicago, Rogers Park has some diversity. It's about the only neighborhood that I know of in Chicago that has lots of African origin diversity, compared to the South Side. So that's one. I don't know how much you know about Rogers Park or how
You mean
much.
for African immigrants? You mean?
Yeah, for diaspora immigrants.
Yeah, yeah.
Kind of
I know a
broad
little
that.
bit about Rogers Park. Yeah.
Yeah, certain parts of it,
Mhm.
that's evolving community. So I'm sure it's changed a lot even since I was, used to stay over there. But the second, comment, fantastic presentation. I in terms of protective factors, I was just, you mentioned that was an area that you have begun to kind of look at, and being 74 myself, I've had the chance to kind of reflect personally as an N=1 on some of these issues, and grandparent caregiving and spirituality seems to be a couple of factors that I've noticed in the literature, broadly speaking, but also personally and socially, I've kind of noticed that those two things certainly seem to have some potential to keep as a protective factors to keep people cognitively accountable, if you will.
Mm-hmm. Totally agree with that. I actually have a spirituality scale in the study. I haven't looked at it yet to see, what it's doing, but I did it because, reading Robert and Linda's work over the years, I knew I had to have something about religiosity, spirituality. So definitely think that's going to be a key factor for a protective factor that I need to delve into.
And then the grandparent caregiving, when people are responsible,
Right.
and something about the engagement with the younger generation,
keeping them young, right?
Keeps people actively, cognitively, engaged in a very unique way, and
Exactly.
sometimes there's even a spiritual element there, right?
Yeah.
But it's certainly, those two factors seems to be, have a potential, as you proceed.
Thank you so much for those suggestions.
So I want to do one thing before we end that we just take 3 or 4 or 5 minutes. And I'm just going to have our young people introduce themselves very quickly. And all I want them to say is, like, I'm a doctoral student in this program, or I'm a postdoc, and my research is on, and then whatever, a phrase, not a sentence or two, but a phrase just for time. But I think it's important for us to meet our young, really great scholars. So Sophia, I'm gonna start with you.
Forgotten what we're supposed to do. Sophia Morrow. I'm a PhD candidate in the Joint Social Work Sociology program at U of M. Phrase to describe my research, colonialism, Black women.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. Andrew. And you're muted, Andrew.
Okay, I didn't know that I was. Well, thank you for the description of being young. So I am new to. I'm looking forward to actually meeting. I'm Dr. MacArthur, again here in North Carolina, teaching at 2 different universities this past fall, which NCCU and also Shaw University, 2 HBCUs, and looking forward to probably moving to another university here in North Carolina, but enjoyed it dramatically. And thank you so much. I've talked to Robert, and thank you so much, and look forward to getting some more information and joining you folks, hopefully into a big collaboration.
Okay, thank you, Andrew.
Alexis.
Everyone, I just graduated with my doctorate in epidemiology from University of Michigan. I'm a postdoc at Stanford University now, and one sentence or a couple phrases. I'm interested in accelerated aging and weathering, especially among Black women and reproductive aging.
Natasha?
Hi, everyone. I am a University of Michigan graduate of the Joint Social Work and Psychology program, currently a postdoc in the School of Public Health, and also an incoming assistant professor at Columbia University. Dr. Taylor, I'll send you the official announcement June 1st when they announce it. But then I study racism awareness and Black youth development.
Well, big congratulations. That's wonderful. Big congratulations. Bernadine.
Hi, Natasha. Can't wait to see you in New York. I am a T32 at Columbian Psychiatry Department, looking at intimate partner violence victimization and help seeking, specifically among African American women.
Mm-hmm. Annalitas, if you are still with us. I know Annalise has young kids.
Yes, I am here. Hi, everyone. My name is Annalise Ochoa, and I am a doctoral candidate in the joint program in social work and sociology. And my research focuses on how plasma donation has become an increasingly common economic coping strategy among predominantly low-income populations, potentially as a consequence of increased inequality and labor market changes, and how this disproportionately affects communities of color.
And I'm gonna guess have two other people. So Maurice, if you are with us. Yes.
I'm still here. Good evening, everyone. My name is Maurice Haskins. I am a doctoral student at UPenn. I'm actually getting a doctorate in a DSW because I am a clinical social worker as my background. My research is looking at intergenerational caregiving and looking at potentially a new sandwich generation, those that are caring for their parents, but also caring for the children that they raise, and looking at the impact of COVID-19 on caregiver stress. Thank you.
Thank you, Maurice. And lastly, Meredith, if you are with us.
Hi, everyone.
Yes.
Hi, everyone. My name is Meredith Hope. I did my postdoc at Michigan, and now I'm going to just finish my first year on the tenure track at the College of Worcester. My research looks at the role of racial discrimination, religion, and health for Black youth and emerging adults.
Thank you, Meredith. And thank you, everybody. I'm not asking all of our really other distinguished faculty who are tenured or close to tenure to introduce themselves just for the sake of time, because they are already well-established people. So hopefully we'll see many of you, if not most of you, if not all of you tomorrow. Again, thank you, everybody. Thank our great presenters. For all the presenters, take a look at the chat. You'll see all the great comments that y'all had, okay? Yeah, we'll see you tomorrow.
Thank you. Good night.
Night, everybody.
Good night.